This session is presented by Dr. Jared by Bahir Browsh, Director of Critical Sports Studies, University of Colorado at Boulder. 50 years after Frank Robinson became the first African-American manager in Major League Baseball, there were only 2 African-American managers and 1 general manager in the MLB. The league also had the lowest ratio of African-American players since 1950. Only 5% of players and 3% of managers in college baseball identify as African-American. This presentation looks at the reason for these low numbers and the value of supporting diverse leaders in sport. Just a little bit more about Dr. Browsh. He's an assistant teaching professor, director of the Critical Sports Studies program here at CU Boulder. Dr. Browsh is a cultural historian, commentator, author, examining the political economics of sport and popular culture, including relationship culture, money, power, identity in the United States and globally. Dr. Browsh's recent work has examined the whitewashing of sport history and the erasure of athletic and cultural contributions of African Americans, women, and other historically marginalized groups, and how the evolution of legal and economic policies that impact the sport and cultural industries both challenge and contribute to the inequities in sport. Their upcoming publications include a chapter on cultural appropriation and globalization efforts by the National Football League, a book on the impact of legalized sports gambling in the United States, and projects examining the use of animation in sports marketing and the history of baseball clubs as a source of ethnic identity and community. Please welcome Dr. Browsh.
It always sounds more impressive when someone else reads my bio. And so let's go. And so looking at this, next month will mark when Frank Robinson became the first African-American manager in baseball. He was hired in 1974, and I'll talk about that history a little bit, but I want to go even further back, and there's him in his first year as manager. When we are looking at this longer history, one of the keys, and Major League Baseball has been really bad about this, is recognizing the history of African Americans in baseball and the growth of black baseball throughout the 20th century. It was just last year where they recognized Josh Gibson, and just a slight portion of Josh Gibson's statistics. It began to be drawn after the Civil War that you had integration or integrated teams in baseball and a lot of sports. The NFL did not segregate until 1933, and it was in 1885 when the last African-American player, Moses Fleetwood Walker, would be forced out of the sport. Some sports had a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement. Others, like the International League, actually wrote it in their rules. And the International League was where Walker was playing before he was forced out of the sport. And so that same year, you had the Cuban Giants. You have a number of Cuban Giant teams, and using the term, even though there are no Cubans on the team, the relationships with Cuba and the less negative feelings toward Cubans led many of those teams to adopt the Cuban Giants, Cuban ex-Giants in Philadelphia. And so many of these teams, like the Harlem Globetrotters and Saperstein, they were financed by white business owners looking to make a profit off of this labor, although you did have S.K. Govern, who was from the Caribbean and had learned baseball later. He was a cricket player who immigrated to the United States, but he was the manager for that team. You have all these barnstorming teams competing many times in exhibitions against white teams, and so you had that awareness of the skill that was in what would become the Negro Leagues a little later, but with that direct competition was knowledge that the talent level was on par. In 1920, well, Rube Foster before 1920 was one of, if not the top pitcher the first decade of the 20th century. But he was annoyed with having to navigate a number of aspects in terms of playing and then eventually wanting to coach in baseball, that it was difficult to get permits to play and to build fields. It was difficult dealing with the low pay from white owners. And so he began organizing, and in 1920 formed what was the first of seven Negro leagues. And so as he develops this league, he also managed the Chicago American Giants, and he makes it a point to, as much as possible, to have black owners along with black coaches and managers. Within his experience, or his ultimate goal was to have full teams merge with Major League Baseball. Because he kind of foresaw what would come later, and I'll talk about it in a minute in terms of the talent loss when integration hit. But and I give you just obviously that's, oops, I changed it on my computer and not there. So you have this, and these collection of teams, many of them were part of that original effort by Rube Foster. Many of them would come later, but like the Cuban X-Giants predated the establishment. And so these franchises existed, but it was that organization portion that really created more consistent competition, allowed for better stat keeping, which Major League Baseball is still navigating and still compiling today, and allowed for the recognition of all-stars and champions. And so the teams found relative success. People like baseball, you had a high talent level, but you have the issue in that teams would actually make more money playing exhibitions against white teams. And so that makes it hard to have a consistent schedule. Some teams would say, I'm actually going to forfeit this series and instead play this major league team like the Yankees, like the Red Sox, Phillies, Athletics, because it brings in a higher gate and it brings in more money. And so there would be uneven schedules and uneven win-loss records. And then Rube Foster basically had a nervous breakdown after working so hard to organize and maintain this league. And so within a year of his death, the league was failing and ultimately would fold. But others, including Cumberland Posey, who's in both the Basketball and Football Hall of Fame, Basketball and Baseball Hall of Fame, was managing the Homestead Grays and started the East-West League, which is another recognized Negro league. And so you have this very tight community within African American sports and African American culture in general. And so that the ability for Posey, who was fairly well known because of his exploits, especially in the Pittsburgh area, was able to create a new league and bring some of those teams over from Rube Foster's Negro National League to continue to move forward. And then you have these continued delays that some general managers and owners in baseball started having those conversations around integration. But at the time, you have Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who's the commissioner of baseball, and horrific racist, that he was the one who oversaw Jack Johnson's trial when he was charged with the Mann Act, and then he was put in charge after the Black Sox scandal in 1919 to become the first commissioner. And during the World War II period, he because it should be diplomatic, but he finally died. And that was a benefit to moving integration forward. And so when you have the end of World War II, you start having tryouts. The Red Sox actually tried out Jackie Robinson before he signed with the Dodgers, but many of these tryouts were just for show. That you did have more public pressure for integration, but many of these teams would just have the tryout and then wouldn't have follow-up. And as evidence of that, Red Sox would be the last team in Major League Baseball to integrate. And so their efforts were disingenuous in inviting Jackie Robinson for a tryout. He would sign with the Montreal Royals, and then he would, after a year with the Royals in AAA, he would advance to the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. And that's Posey there with playing basketball for the Homestead Grays, because many of these, oops, gotta remember, I just gotta hold this in my hand. And so there he is. And like I said, he, both for his contributions to basketball and baseball, he's in both Hall of Fames, and there's Jackie Robinson at his contract signing. And so one of the issue, and this is an issue with integration and social integration in general, that what ultimately happened was integration mainly benefited primarily white institutions, because you had this top talent coming from various other institutions and various other areas going to primarily white institutions, but without that leadership and without that, that opportunity to advance in other segments of that industry, like in baseball. And so ultimately, this was the demise of the Negro Leagues. When you lose players like Robinson, although he only played a year in those leagues, when you lose Satchel Paige and Larry Roby and the players that would make their way to the major leagues, which had unspoken quotas as well, that most teams at most had 4, but typically 2, so they could room together on the road as they typically stayed with other families, because hotels would not allow them to stay there. By 1951, what we know as the Negro Leagues were basically over. A few independent leagues would continue, and they even lasted till 1951 because they served as a minor league, because most of those teams that survived after 1947 were in the South. And they served the purpose of, in a segregated baseball environment in the South, they still served to bring players like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays from their short stint in those leagues to the major leagues. And then by the 50s, you see this next wave. I mentioned Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, but Frank Robinson was part of that wave, as the third wave as well, that now you have players that are playing their entire careers in Major League Baseball, and we see it in the statistics that Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, 2 of the top home run hitters and top players of all time. Frank Robinson, when he retired, who had the 4th most home runs. And so you have the success on the field, but players were not getting opportunities off the field to coach, to manage, or even scout. Eventually, by the early 60s, a few scouts would emerge, and something that we also see in college sports, to have those relationships with African-American players they wanted to identify and bring up to the major leagues. And so you have Buck O'Neil, who discovered Lou Brock. He coached Ernie Banks. And so he had those relationships from managing in the Negro Leagues and playing in the Negro Leagues. And then I had Bill Russell there because by the late 60s, he's offered the opportunity to coach the Boston Celtics, but he had to do it as a player coach. And that's something I'll talk about in a minute in terms of Frank Robinson's experience, but he was groundbreaking, and he was unapologetically black, that he was involved with the civil rights movement, with the labor movement and the NBA, and it ruffled a lot of people's feathers. And we were talking about this in class the other day, that people vandalized his house and defecated in his bed. And this is the player who led that team to 8 straight world championships, receiving this treatment in Boston, and he's still willing to coach that team to several more championships after Red Auerbach retired as coach. And then with Frank Robinson, he was born in Texas, but like many throughout the Great Migration, his family moved to the Bay Area, and he was surrounded by incredible athletes. Part of the reason why I had Bill Russell up there is he was a high school teammate of Bill Russell, and he was also a teammate of Curt Flood, who is another instrumental figure in baseball when you're talking about free agency. And agency in general within sport. He was the first player to win MVP in both leagues, which he was the only one until recently. But he still wasn't fully respected by the Reds, that ultimately his general manager with the Reds said he's not a young 30. And ultimately traded him to the Orioles, where he would go on to win another MVP and 2 World Series. So I think he had a little bit left in the tank after he was traded from Cincinnati. He would go on to play for the Dodgers and the Angels, and then he was actually traded from the Angels to Cleveland because he was campaigning to be their manager. And they just got tired of that, and so they traded him to Cleveland, and he would have the opportunity to manage was hired to manage in 1974. Now, he was planning to retire as a player, but the general manager and owner was like, well, you're a well-known player. You can keep playing. And that was one of the points of contention with him and management. And also the fact that the general manager with Cleveland at the time kept undermining his decisions. He was also would have conflicts with Gaylord Perry, who was their star pitcher at the time. And so in spite of all of this, he was willing to accept that job. But within all of this is the remembering Jackie Robinson, because Jackie really wanted to be a manager, and actually Branch Rickey had promised him to be a manager, but Branch Rickey lost his own position. And so let me see if this is going to play automatically, or just a minute video, because in 1972, you have the 25th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, and they honored him at the World Series. And so at the time, he was going blind, and was very sick, but he really wanted to make this speech to make the point for the next steps in baseball. That's about right. And I probably just uploaded a virus to this computer as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce to you an old...
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I would just like to say that I was really just a spoke in the wheel of the success that we had some 25 years ago, and personally want to say thank you to a great captain, a guy who was the leader of our ball club and who really set the pace in many, many areas. Pee Wee, thanks so much for being here today. I would like to also say that I would be a real pleasure if Mr. Rickey could have been here with us today, but to the members of the family, my entire love and gratitude for the things that he's done over the years. And I also want to say how pleased I am that my family can be here this afternoon, and to thank baseball for the tremendous opportunities that it has presented to me, and also for this thrilling afternoon. I'm extremely proud and pleased to be here this afternoon, but must admit I'm going to be tremendously more pleased and more proud when I look at that third base coaching line one day and see a black face managing in baseball. Thank you very much.
And so he would pass away 9 days later. And I mean, Robinson's career is really, really interesting that as he got older, he became more outspoken. He was the only former or current player to show up at Curt Flood's hearing during the Supreme Court case around the reserve clause in free agency in baseball. And so it'd be 2 years later when Frank Robinson got his opportunity. So like I said, he was pushed to play, that he wanted to retire as a player and focus on managing, and he felt that being a player manager actually undermined his authority, that he was just kind of a figurehead and not the leader of the team. He did lead Cleveland to their first winning record since 1968, but the next season they started off slow. It wasn't embarrassingly slow, but ultimately Cleveland felt they got enough out of Frank and fired him midway through 1976. He was ultimately not playing by that point, and so that was probably part of the decision as well, that he wasn't bringing in fans by being on the field, and so ultimately they moved on from him. But he continued to manage. He managed a few years later. He got the opportunity to manage the San Francisco Giants. He came back to his old team where he won MVP with the Orioles and actually won Manager of the Year in 1989. And that's another point in this as well, that even when coaches in various sports, like Bill Russell, like Lenny Wilkins in basketball, awards are often a way to gatekeep these players from the record book. And even there were talks about, with Hank Aaron, putting an asterisk next to his record when he broke Babe Ruth's home run record. Which is interesting because Babe Ruth didn't play against African Americans, and so you have that aspect that's ignored, but the fact that Hank Aaron played a few more games a year was a reason to put an asterisk next to his record, which he ultimately did not do. And then that same year in which he was chasing the home run record, he got an award from the post office for the celebrity with the most mail, ignoring the fact that over half that mail was death threats and other forms of hate mail. And also it's the year that Frank Robinson won the Manager of the Year is the first year where you had a black coach in the NFL. And so, again, you still have this catching up and why the Rooney Rule, which deserves its whole other speech in terms of its lack of effectiveness, exists at all. And so, another aspect of this as well, and what we often see with managers from marginalized groups is that when they do get an opportunity, it's not always the best opportunity. That even when he was manager of the Expos, who then moved to Washington, he was actually in the league office as an executive and was asked to manage because Major League Baseball owned that team, and the Expos, they were not putting money toward the Expos by that point, and we're just waiting for them to move to DC. And so similarly, when Don Baylor got his opportunity to manage, it was with an expansion franchise, the Rockies here. And so when these opportunities do come, the art shell is a little different because Al Davis was a little more, and again, it's a very low bar in the NFL, but was a little more progressive than the other owners. But ultimately, these opportunities are often less than desirable jobs in which they're breaking ground. And then as we look at the 80s and 90s, we see this incredible growth on the field, that you have players like Griffey, Barry Bonds. I, as a Phillies fan, I had to put Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard in there. You have Tony Gwynn, Derek Jeter, this collection of players. CeCe Sabathia, and I'll talk about him again in a second because he came out of a program that was meant to, oh, actually, I thought it was in the next slide, but he came out of the RBI program, which was started by John Young, who had a cup of coffee in Major League, but he saw this continuing problem, especially in inner cities in lower income areas where they didn't have, young people didn't have access to baseball and equipment and other opportunities. And so RBI is now sponsors, now Nike RBI, but they still exist, but they're really, their most influential era were the 90s, that they were actually going out in communities. They were building fields. They were giving little leagues and high schools equipment. Whereas now they run some tournaments and things like that, but it's become a global program, and that has undermined their efforts in U.S. cities to offer opportunities to play baseball. And then you have a few years in the 90s, and I mentioned that in the last slide with Don Baylor, Dusty Baker, and others getting an opportunity, but then you start seeing, especially by the mid-90s, kind of these efforts be undermined. And this is from a study of a 26-year period between 95 and 2021 done by Global Sports Matter, that you have a deficit of managers being fired versus being hired, coming from that identify as Black. And so on the other side, among white managers, the numbers are about the same, that the same amount of managers that are being fired are also being hired. And then you have 1 out of 6, so 16% of white managers have no experience, that are either coming straight from the field or another job into that position, where every single African-American manager had coaching experience in Major League Baseball. And so this also heightened expectation in terms of experience is another piece of this as well, that managers of color are often asked to prove themselves more than their white counterparts. And then we see these other statistics here where you have a shorter length of time in which managers of color, and this is, again, this is where kind of some of the numbers get a little bit combined in their study, because they also included Latino managers as well. But managers of color were dismissed after just over 4 years, where almost a full year more of average tenure of white managers. You also have these numbers in kind of the reduction of opportunities, that in that 95 to 99 period, You have one black manager and one manager of color at all hired out of 32 managers. In that next period, which is the 8-year period, 50 managers total were hired. And then you do have 20 managers of color, and 11 of them are black, and then the numbers drop, where you have 121 white managers hired, 16 managers of color, and 4 of them are black. And so, and we still see some of them in major leagues today. And so you also hear the same names over and over, and partly due to their success. Dusty Baker just retired. You have Ron Washington with the Angels. You have the reigning World Series champion and Dave Roberts with the Dodgers. But you're not seeing new names come up in terms of opportunities to manage or even coach. And so, just to, again, as I talked about too, there's only one African-American general manager, and he's with the Astros, Dana Brown. And then the last three of the last 5 World Series champions were managed by African-American managers, with Dusty Baker and the Astros. And as a Phillies fan, it hurts me to say that. And then you have Dave Roberts winning a couple in the last 5 years, including the previous season. And they continue to load up with more and more talent. And the college numbers are especially stark, that only 3% of Division I managers last season identified as African American. Of those, of these 26 managers, 17 of them were from HBCUs. So there's only 9 managers from outside HBCUs that are African American that are managing Division I college baseball teams. And then you have this, and part of this issue is also the participation aspect as well, that only 6% of black students in urban high schools have played high school baseball at all. And then this is lower than at rural and suburban schools. And so it's clearly a financing and money issue, especially after COVID and so much reduction of education budgets, especially toward extracurriculars. And then you also have, and just to use a case study in Oakland, and I don't have the years there, but about 20 years ago, there were about 1,200 players within their Babe Ruth League, and 90% of them were black. Now it's at 250, and only 40% of them are black. And this is a story of not just gentrification, but the issues within youth sports that I'll talk about in a second. But there's Dave Roberts. And then, and so just to give you some of these reasons that, as I talked about, urban high schools are dropping baseball, both because of money, but also because of fewer and fewer fields existing in these areas. Participation in top travel teams can cost thousands of dollars a year, and I have some numbers in the next slide. And so you also have the financial burden. And so you have sports like baseball and others becoming more and more affluent, not just among African Americans, but across all races. You also have the fact that, and this is something that is more, that baseball is dealing with overall, but baseball not being seen as cool, not visible, and too slow, which you're trying to fix with the pitch clock and other issues, but also the visibility. And this relates to the high school aspect because football and basketball are the 2 least likely sports that they'll cut because of popularity and because of the pipeline to college scholarships. And the lack of visibility for baseball, which is more seen, especially in the amateur ranks or in the amateur and college ranks, as a regional sport. And most of the top college programs are in the South or West. And then you also have the lack of or the growth of accessibility of sports like soccer, and even track maintaining its popularity because of being a more affordable sport than baseball, along with the travel aspects as well. You also have historically the issue of stacking, that the positions that are typically tapped for leadership and also are more visible when it comes to NIL and sponsorships and just general popularity African American players have historically been discouraged from playing. So this is pitcher, catcher, and middle infield. Obviously, CC Sabathia, as I talked about before, is one of those outliers, but we see that issue still being maintained in certain aspects of not just college, but high school and even Little League. And again, these are just some of the numbers in terms of the cost of youth sports that you see there, that, and this is kind of the maximum range, but for many travel teams, it can cost families up to $15,000 a year. And you have other sports like, interesting, ice hockey is another one that they didn't put on the chart, but ice hockey, like tennis, can cost upwards of $30,000-$40,000 a year. And so again, you have that the socioeconomic disparity. And then I know the middle slide is a little bit hard to see, but it just breaks down the costs. And more so, it's cost to even register for the team, along with the equipment and other travel needs. And then that kind of, it's a little hard to see some of this, but we see kind of the biggest issue is cost right now in terms of entering many of these sports. And then other factors kind of tying to that is the decline in those pipelines from amateur baseball to professional ranks. And then an underlying issue, and you have executives saying this, that it actually costs more to scout American players and to train American players than it does players in other countries. That in countries like Dominican Republic, children are dropping out of school at 10 or 11 and are being given verbal agreements at the age of 12. And then they start training to make the major leagues full time. And this includes 12, 13-year-olds taking performance-enhancing drugs, and again, because they're verbal agreements, the teams can back out at any time, but the player thinks he's promised an opportunity as a result of a scout from any major league team saying, oh yeah, we'll sign you when you turn 16, and the fact that that's the minimum age, along with the fact that they're even making these handshake agreements at the age of 12, is something the federal government is investigating along with Major League Baseball, trying to navigate that. And there's a lack of concern or action when it comes to other various issues that kind of can compile upon each other, like the lowered fan attendance in general, but including from the Black community. You have fan racism, and this is an issue that Mookie Betts and others have brought up, that fans are yelling really derogatory things, and that can lead fans, especially young fans, to not want to play the game. And then you also have teams moving stadiums and franchises. It might not seem like this would impact it, but it does reduce fandom among certain communities. You have Atlanta Braves moving from downtown Atlanta to the suburbs. You have Oakland now moving to Las Vegas. You have these areas that used to be hotbeds for this talent no longer having teams in their city, even if they represent that city, not having a stadium or their team to be easily accessible as a result. Yeah. But I mean, it's okay. Yeah, I'm almost done. And so that's just the regionality. And I have Henry Meha there because you have 50% of players that have been caught or have tested positive for PEDs are from the Dominican Republic. And he's brought up that's partly the legacy of their experience in amateur sports. And then this is my last slide. And so some of the issues or things that can be done that can overcome these obstacles to leadership and honestly participation is the older the league is, the stronger the old boys network tends to be. And so we see the rehiring of the same coaches in spite of a lack of success. And we see this in a lot of sports, including football, where instead of hiring someone new, they know someone who knows someone, and eventually they get the job. And so navigating that, and that's where kind of the Rooney Rule was supposed to break up, but like I said, there's a number of issues in terms of, as we know from the Brian Flores lawsuit, that they're just interviewing and it doesn't actually include hiring numbers, although it was good to hear that the NFL is at least not abandoning their efforts, but their efforts are not super strong to begin with. And then you have these stronger pipelines. They've made some one-off efforts. They continue to maintain RBI, but with the Nike influence, which brings some questions in terms of whether, much like AAU, whether those players are beholden to Nike as they move up the ranks. And then you also have the Dream Series in Arizona, which just ran last weekend, where you have a training opportunity for African-American players, particularly pitchers and catchers, to both get some training from major league level coaches while also networking. And then you also have a Andre Dawson Classic, which happened in a couple weeks in Florida at the Jackie Robinson Complex, that includes series between HBCU teams. And that, at least last year, was aired on MLB Network. But again, there isn't a ton of promotion because it happens in February instead of happening a little later. And then they do some events around the All-Star Game and things like that. And you have kind of superficial efforts like Jackie Robinson Day, but ultimately they don't really embrace and highlight those histories of those players, especially pre-integration. And so higher involvement from USA Baseball, also strengthening the relationship between Major League Baseball and the NCAA might help a little bit, but having more events like the Andre Dawson Classic and others that highlight HBCUs and other universities, and to bring visibility to the sport and its African-American participants. And then along with history, more diversity efforts. And when I say in the stands, I mean really tap down on that racism that many players hear and face on the field, while also addressing these issues in the media, advancing knowledge about these unknown and overlooked and really attempted erasure of the histories pre-integration and pre-1947. Thank you.